billionaire pretending to be a plumber. Until the maid saved his children from his fiancée. A billionaire, haunted by suspicion that his soon-to-be wife might be secretly mistreating his two young children, did something no one could have imagined. In a desperate attempt to uncover the truth, he disguised himself as a plumber and took up a quiet, invisible existence in the basement of his own home, determined to see with his own eyes what unfolded behind closed doors. What he discovered changed everything. A cruel stepmother, children living in silent fear, and a brave housekeeper who found the courage to stand up for them, even at the risk of losing the only job that kept her afloat. And when that wealthy father finally stripped away his disguise in front of everyone, the truth erupted like a storm. This is a story of vengeance, of love, and of justice that will linger with you long after the last word is read. The house stood quietly beside the still waters of Percy Priest Lake in Nashville, Tennessee, but there was no peace inside its walls. Thomas Callahan, a 58-year-old businessman who had built his legacy in clean energy, sat silently in an SUV parked several blocks away from his own mansion. He wasn't avoiding home because of work or a lack of love. It was something else. A heavy unease pressing against his chest, a father's instinct sharpened by years of heartbreak and healing. Lately, Emily, his 7-year-old daughter, had fallen into an unusual silence. She used to rush to the door whenever he came home, chattering breathlessly about school, tugging along her little brother Jackson, who had just turned 3. But now, she only peered quietly from behind the staircase. Jackson no longer lifted his arms for a hug. Then, there were those faint bruises along her arm. Melinda, his fiancée, dismissed them lightly as scrapes from the slide. But there was something in Emily's eyes that stopped him from believing it fully. She wasn't lying, not outright, but she was hiding. One day, Tom asked gently if anything happened while he was away. Emily looked straight into his eyes, then lowered hers and whispered, "When you're not home, everything feels different." "Different how, sweetheart?" he pressed, but she only shook her head and mumbled that she must have been mistaken. What he saw in her eyes then wasn't confusion. It was fear. Real fear. And in that moment, he knew his instincts weren't wrong. Tom was a man of logic, but also a man who had lost his wife to cancer 4 years earlier. Since then, his world had narrowed to 2 small hearts beating under his roof. He couldn't afford to be wrong. Yet he couldn't accuse Melinda on nothing but a shadow of doubt. To the world, she was flawless, poised in public, graceful in gatherings, always knowing the right thing to say. She had been introduced as the ideal partner. But what if behind that polished smile was something darker? Tom had seen the ugliest truths hiding behind, the kindest faces. He couldn't let himself be blind. He couldn't let his children suffer while he stood idle in the same house and did nothing. So he made a decision, not confrontation, not yet. He would find the truth quietly. And to do that, he chose a method no one would ever see coming. A plumber. A man rendered invisible, slipping beneath the floors of his own home, watching from the shadows. Only by witnessing it himself could he know for sure. If he was wrong, no harm done. But if he was right, then he would not hesitate. He would protect his children with everything he had. Because a father, a husband, a man cannot stand by while his children tremble in fear under the very roof they call home. And so began 2 weeks of life beneath the floorboards, a plan so unconventional that even his attorney called it madness. But for Tom, it wasn't madness. It was the only thing a father could do if he still had a heart worth calling his own. Before we continue with part 2, if you're listening to this story and feel it stirring something deep within your heart, take just a moment to subscribe to the Emotional Echoes channel. Every like, share, and subscription not only helps spread these moving stories, but also gives us the encouragement to keep bringing you more heartfelt content each and every day. Where are you listening from? Leave a comment below and let us know how far our message has reached. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you won't miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let's step into the second chapter of this emotional journey together. Tom couldn't sleep that night. He lay awake in the small upstairs study, the faint glow of his laptop screen casting a dim light over his tense face. Beside him was his phone, still displaying a message that had weighed heavily on his mind. It was from Emily's teacher, Miss Harper, a woman who had been teaching second grade for more than 10 years. The message was brief, yet it struck him like a stone pressing down on his chest. I just wanted to let you know that Emily seems more withdrawn than usual. She's not as energetic as she used to be and tends to avoid eye contact when her name is called. Tom had read and reread those words dozens of times over the past 2 days. He hadn't replied. He hadn't shown the message to anyone. There was only one person he had mentioned it to. Brian, his closest friend since college, now his personal attorney, and the one person who knew, better than anyone else, the weight of grief that had descended upon Tom's family after his wife died 4 years ago. The next day, Tom met Brian at an old cafe tucked away in East Nashville. The air was crisp, the ground blanketed in fallen golden leaves, and inside, soft jazz drifted through the warm space. Brian, seeing the look on Tom's face, set his newspaper aside without a word. He didn't ask questions. He simply waited. And Tom told him everything. About Emily and Jackson, the subtle changes, the quiet tension, the teacher's message, and the times he caught Melinda looking at the children with a coldness that didn't belong in a home. Brian listened in silence, taking a slow sip of his coffee before speaking, his words direct, as always. You could confront her. Be honest. Tell her what you've noticed. Tom shook his head. I have no proof. If she denies it or turns it around, I'll look like a paranoid father. And what if I'm wrong? Brian tapped a finger against the wooden table. So what's your plan? Are you thinking of hiring someone to watch her? A private investigator? Tom said nothing for a long time, then finally spoke, his voice low. What I'm about to do might make you think I've lost my mind, but I can't see another way. I want to pose as a plumber, in my own house. Brian laughed, but the smile faded quickly when he caught the seriousness in Tom's eyes. Tom continued. Melinda asked to have the hot water system upgraded last month. I haven't sent anyone in yet. I'll use that as a reason to be there, but not as myself. She thinks I'll be in Seattle for an investment conference. On paper, I'll disappear. In reality, I'll be living in the basement watching, listening, seeing what happens above me. Brian shook his head slowly. You're turning yourself into a character in a spy movie, Tom. But if you really believe something's wrong, I'll help you do this the right way. At the very least, we'll make sure you don't leave behind a legal mess when it's over. For 3 long days, Tom prepared every detail with meticulous care. He hired a local stage actor to impersonate him during a few brief Zoom calls, just enough to keep the illusion intact. Brian handled the legal groundwork so Tom would not face accusations of invading privacy within the very home he owned. Then Tom went to a hardware store and bought an old toolbox, several worn work uniforms, a faded cap, and a pair of scuffed leather shoes. When he looked at himself in the mirror, he barely recognized the man staring back. Short, unshaved stubble, dark circles beneath his eyes, and the quiet posture of someone who had spent a lifetime working with his hands. He knocked on the basement door and spoke to Melinda in a gentle voice. Love, the company in Seattle needs me urgently. This trip might last a few weeks. Melinda did not ask many questions. She simply said she would take good care of the children. But Tom caught a flicker in her eyes, something that looked unsettlingly like relief. That evening, while he pretended to pack upstairs, he overheard Melinda making a phone call. Her voice was soft, yet every word cut through him with chilling clarity. He is gone. Finally, I can teach these children the way I want to. No more chaos every time they get spoiled. Tom froze where he stood. A part of him wanted to confront her at once, to rip open every lie, but a stronger part held him still. He needed more. He needed the full truth. And to get it, he had to disappear. The next morning, the plumber arrived at the back door, tapping lightly on the wooden frame before beginning his quiet work. He was no longer Thomas Callahan, the billionaire known in the clean energy world, but Tom, the man living in the basement, waiting for the moment when he would finally know if his children were safe. That morning dawned under a veil of mist, as if Nashville had been draped in a pale gray shroud. A small truck with temporary plates, rented by Brian, parked along the side of the lakeside home. The back door opened and a man in a faded cap, worn jeans and a weathered canvas jacket, stepped out, carrying a heavy toolbox. No one would have recognized him as Thomas Callahan, the man once invited to speak at a national investment conference, the man whose face had appeared on the cover of a leading business journal that same year. Now he was simply Tom, the plumber Melinda believed had been sent by the contractor. Tracy, the housekeeper who had worked there less than a month, opened the door. She was about 31, petite, with neatly tied brown hair and eyes that held both awareness and caution. When she saw him, she offered a small, polite smile. "You are the plumber. Melinda told me someone would arrive this morning." Tom lowered his voice, sounding shy. "Yes, my name is Tom. Folks usually call me the pipe man." Tracy led him through the side entrance and down a hallway toward the basement, explaining as she walked. "The hot water system often acts up. The pressure drops and sometimes it makes a strange clicking sound at night. Melinda is very particular, so if anything seems off, she will definitely say so." Tom nodded and descended slowly into the dim basement. A strange feeling rose in him. This had once been a place where he stored wine and old documents. Now it was becoming a refuge for a man trying to uncover the truth about his own home. The main basement room held a narrow bed, an old wooden table, and a few weak yellow lights. There was the faint scent of dampness and aging wood. Tom set down his bag and began shaping his disguise into something believable. He pinned old newspapers to the wall, scattered plumbing schematics near the bed, and plugged in a small kettle for instant coffee. Everything needed to look like a temporary workspace for a laboring man staying a few weeks. He even brought an old wristwatch that no longer worked and a printed family photo found online, placing it on the table as a personal keepsake. But in his toolbox lay something far more important: a tiny recording device and 2 cameras disguised as climate sensors. Tom knew the architecture of the house intimately. He had designed the renovation plans 5 years earlier when he purchased the property. He chose 2 strategic locations for the recording devices, one in the kitchen where Melinda spent much of her time, and one in the hallway of the 2nd floor near the children's bedrooms. Installing them required absolute silence and perfect timing. Each time he ventured upstairs, he waited until Tracy had gone to the market or Melinda had left the house. The risk was immense, but Tom understood that if he wanted to protect Emily and Jackson, he needed evidence, not suspicions, not fear, only the truth, captured clearly and undeniably. The first day passed with a heavy, unrelenting weight. Tom spent most of it in the basement, dismantling and reassembling segments of old piping, creating just enough noise to convince Melinda that real work was being done. When he went upstairs to check the water heater in the laundry room, he accidentally crossed paths with her. She wore a silk robe, her hair pinned high, a cup of coffee in hand, her eyes sliding past him as if he were nothing more than a shadow. "Hurry it up. I can't stand this racket every single day," she muttered before turning away. Tom lowered his head. "Yes, ma'am." And in that moment, he saw it. The subtle narrowing of her eyes when she heard the way he addressed her. No one called Melinda ma'am, but she didn't dwell on it, because a man like Tom, in dirty clothes and with a roughened voice, was not someone worth suspecting. Late in the afternoon, he heard the patter of small footsteps echoing through the hallway. Emily and Jackson had returned from the preschool nearby. His heart ached at the sound of their brief laughter, a flicker of childhood joy quickly extinguished by a sharp-clipped voice. "Emily, put your backpack down properly. Jackson, you've spilled water again." Melinda's tone wasn't loud, but it held a chill that could silence a room. Tom stood behind the basement door, left slightly ajar, his hand gripping the knob so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had once believed he knew this woman, but from the very first day behind his new disguise, he understood that he was stepping into a battle where the enemy carried no weapon, yet had the power to make even the smallest children tremble inside the walls of their own home. That night, as the lakefront house fell into stillness, Tom sat alone in the basement, the dim yellow light casting his shadow across a wall stained with age and dampness. The first recording device had already been placed, hidden within a false outlet behind the bookcase in the upstairs hallway. Only one device remained to be installed in the kitchen. He knew it would require absolute precision. Melinda guarded that space with an almost territorial vigilance, managing every detail with unyielding control. Tom began to document everything in a worn leather notebook, writing down every word, every shift in Melinda's tone, every response from the children. It was the only way to remain grounded in the midst of rising anger and a slow-burning sorrow. Even he had not expected how heavy the burden would become after just a single day. The next morning, Tom rose before the sun had fully touched the lake. He mixed a small packet of instant coffee with hot water and waited for the first footsteps to echo from the floor above. As he expected, Tracy was the first to enter the kitchen. She wore her cream uniform, her hair neatly tied back, a cloth folded in her hand. Tom stepped up from the basement, pretending to inspect the pipework behind the dishwasher. Tracy startled when she saw him. "You stay here all the time. I thought you only came for a few hours each day." Tom wiped his hands on a coarse towel. "I have to repair the whole system, so I was given permission to stay in the basement. The homeowner approved it." She studied him for a moment, suspicion flickering but never turning unkind. "Have you eaten? I can prepare breakfast if you want." Tom shook his head, his voice low and steady. "Thank you. Coffee is enough." Tracy nodded and returned to her work, and she became the first person in that house who did not look at him with disdain. Around midday, after Melinda left with a friend for a spa appointment, Tracy quietly carried a plate of eggs and some slices of bread down to the basement. She set the tray on the table without ceremony. "You have not eaten since morning. Sometimes physical work makes people forget the time." Tom lifted his gaze to her, his unshaven face and shadowed eyes calm, but carrying a depth that did not need to be spoken aloud. "Thank you. I owe you a sincere thanks." Tracy settled on the chair across from him, her voice soft. "I used to work in a home where the parents argued constantly. The child never said a word. Emily reminds me of that little one." Tom watched her closely. "Has she said anything?" Tracy shook her head. "No words. Only her eyes, always looking like she's trying to escape from something. I think you are the only person in this house she's not afraid of, even though you just arrived." Tom lowered his voice. "I know I'm a stranger. But if you see anything wrong, anything at all, please tell me." Tracy remained silent for a long moment before nodding. "If something dangerous happens, I will tell you. But you need to be careful. I do not think Melinda is the kind of woman who reacts kindly when she senses someone watching her." For the first time since stepping into the role of the plumber, Tom allowed himself a small smile. "I have handled some of the most complicated leaks you could imagine. I think I will manage." Yet the words were nothing more than a mask to steady his appearance. Inside him, the truth was settling more firmly. Melinda did not need to strike to wound. She used words and cold glances, sharpened and precise. And Emily and Jackson, children too young to understand the cruelty of adults, were learning to be silent the way a leaf falls without a sound. Tom tightened his fist. He was no longer merely an observer. From that moment on, he and Tracy formed an unspoken pact, a quiet alliance stretching from the basement to the kitchen, binding two strangers together by a single purpose: protect the children. Tom soon discovered that the old ventilation system in the house, untouched during past renovations, offered him an unexpected advantage. From the basement, he could press his ear against a metal air duct near the ceiling and hear every sound drifting down from the kitchen and living room. One afternoon, while Melinda believed he was busy repairing a valve behind the laundry room, he sat motionless beside the cold metal, his breath slow, his pencil ready. What he heard was not shouting or explosive anger, but a more chilling form of control, precise and quiet, like a blade gliding through the air. Melinda instructed Emily to arrange the dinner table again and again, each spoon, each napkin, each glass placed with rigid accuracy, her voice never raised but sharpened into something that left no room for mistakes. When Emily placed the water glass in the wrong spot, he heard a faint clink, followed by that cold, clipped voice. "How many times must I remind you? Are you not ashamed to do things wrong in front of others?" Then came the scrape of a chair and the hurried footsteps of a small child. No crying. That was what broke Tom's heart the most. Emily no longer cried. Perhaps she had learned that tears did not soften anyone's voice, They only made the anger grow. One day, Jackson spilled a small amount of apple juice onto the carpet. Melinda's voice rang out sharp and loud. "What are you trying to pull now?" The boy was only 3 years old. He was simply learning to hold a cup with both hands, but her voice remained icy. "Where are your toys now?" She didn't wait for an answer. Tom heard the dragging of footsteps, the hard slam of a cabinet door, and then the unmistakable sound of something being tossed into the trash. It was almost certainly one of Jackson's favorite toys, perhaps the stuffed elephant he clutched every night as he fell asleep. Then came the sound of the boy's crying, soft but choking, like it had been held in too long. Melinda offered no comfort. Instead, she spoke with irritated finality. "If you keep acting like this, you won't be allowed to play with anything anymore." Tom pulled away from the vent, his whole body rigid. Sweat beaded on his forehead, though the basement remained cool. He asked himself, how long had this been happening? How long had his children been living in fear while he believed he was giving them a safe and steady home? Tom began adjusting the hidden cameras to capture not only sound, but images. He synchronized the recordings with the audio from the listening device, preserving every scolding, every resigned silence from the children. Everything was saved to a separate hard drive, which he stored inside a small steel box hidden beneath the floorboards under the bed. Each night, once Melinda had gone to bed and the house had fallen quiet, he would sit alone under the weak light of the desk lamp and listen to the day's recordings, not to punish himself, but to be certain he wasn't imagining it, to know beyond doubt that the fear in his children's eyes wasn't just the invention of an anxious father. One evening, while he was seated beside the air duct, Tom heard Tracy's voice, quiet and low. She was in Emily's room, likely helping the girl get ready for bed. Her voice was warm and unhurried, unlike anyone else in the house. "You don't have to be afraid, Emily. When your daddy comes back, everything will get better." Tom did not move. Emily's voice came after a long pause, barely more than a whisper, as if confessing something she hadn't wanted to believe. "He's not coming back. He left us." Tom closed his eyes. His heart clenched as though in someone else's hand. His daughter had already let go of hope. He had allowed her to believe that when he walked out of the house with a suitcase, he was truly gone. All while he had been hiding just beneath her feet. He couldn't speak. He couldn't break cover. He couldn't rush upstairs to hold her, to comfort her, to explain. All he could do was sit in the dark, ears pressed to the cold metal, with a heart slowly breaking in silence. And the more he listened, the more he understood. Melinda didn't need to shout every day to wound a child. She only needed calculated indifference, a consistent chill that dulled their sense of worth, and eventually the victim would fold in on themselves until they forgot what love had ever felt like. Tom knew he couldn't remain in the basement forever, but before he stepped into the light, he needed enough proof, not for revenge, but to reclaim the childhood his children were losing, piece by piece, within the walls of a home that should have been their shelter. Thursday morning began with a gentle light filtering through the kitchen curtains, but inside the lakefront house, nothing felt gentle at all. Tom sat motionless in the basement, a cup of cold coffee in his hand, eyes fixed on the small monitor showing a clear live feed from the hidden camera in the kitchen. The image was sharp, detailed, revealing the quiet domestic stage where Melinda was preparing breakfast. Emily and Jackson were already seated at the table, their eyes cast downward toward their plates, as if bracing for a verdict. Tom knew this routine intimately now, the rhythm of footsteps across hardwood floors, the click of the refrigerator door, the kind of conversations that appeared ordinary but were steeped in quiet tension. Melinda set down 2 small plates. Emily's had a single slice of toast, burned around the edges, and a few thin slices of apple. Jackson's plate held only a half-filled cup of milk, placed precariously near the edge of the table. Tom narrowed his eyes. Jackson had always liked his milk warm in the morning. Tom used to heat it himself, then blow gently across the surface before handing it to his son's small, waiting hands. Now the boy sat still, lifting the cup with his tiny fingers as though he were holding something fragile and dangerous. Melinda didn't sit with them. She leaned against the kitchen counter, phone in hand, glancing up now and then like a proctor overseeing an exam. Emily tried to spear a slice of apple with her fork, but her hand trembled slightly and a piece slipped, falling to the floor. Jackson, still gripping his cup, nudged it too far and the milk tipped, spilling across the table and dripping to the floor around the legs of his chair. Tom watched as everything seemed to slow, like a silent film unfolding frame by frame. Both children froze. Then Melinda turned, eyes flashing as if she'd caught some unforgivable offense. "Unbelievable," she hissed, walking over with steps sharp and controlled. "Can't you even hold a cup of milk, Jackson?" Her voice turned to Emily. "And you, dropping food on the floor. Is that your new habit?" No one answered. Emily lowered her head. Jackson reached for the cup, but his small hands, now sticky with milk, fumbled clumsily. Melinda snatched a paper towel, not to help him, but to avoid getting anything on her heels. She tossed the cup into the sink with a loud clatter, crossed her arms, and declared coldly, "Starting tomorrow, both of you clean up your own messes. If you spill something, you don't get to eat." Those words were not about teaching responsibility. They were punishment, plain and deliberate, and the most painful part was the silence that followed. Neither child cried, neither protested. They just bowed their heads quietly, like they had already learned that mistakes meant consequences, not comfort. Tom clenched his fist. His entire body burned with helplessness, but he couldn't burst through the door. Not yet. Not without the proof. Not until he could show the world that what was happening here wasn't just a parenting style, but a quiet erosion of his children's spirit. As the tension still lingered in the room above, Tracy entered. She carried a tray with cleaning cloths and a bucket. Melinda didn't speak to her, only gave a sharp glance that served as command. Tracy nodded and walked over to the mess, wiping the spilled milk from the floor. Her eyes flicked briefly to the children. Tom saw that look. There was pity in it. Perhaps Tracy had become accustomed to walking into these moments, stepping into the aftermath of Melinda's anger. But she never made a scene. She never overstepped. She didn't scoop the children into her arms or speak words of comfort. She simply wiped the floor, cleared the dishes, and when Melinda turned away, she quietly placed a few slices of banana onto a small extra plate. It was a small gesture, but to Tom, it meant everything. It was kindness without noise, courage without announcement. Tom leaned his head against the cold concrete wall, breathing slow and deep. He was witnessing his children grow up inside a kind of loneliness that had no name. A spilled cup of milk could become a reason for a 3-year-old boy to feel like a burden. A dropped piece of apple could teach a 7-year-old girl that she was a failure. Tom understood now that with each passing day, the wounds were not healing. They were growing with the children. And if he did not act soon, there might come a day when his children no longer remembered what breakfast with laughter felt like, or what it meant for a house to be a home built not just with walls and windows, but with love. Tracy was the only person in that house who didn't make Tom feel like a stranger. She didn't speak much, never inserted herself into household affairs unless necessary. But the way she moved quietly down the hallways, the way her eyes lingered on the children when they were silently enduring, said more than words ever could. After the morning when Jackson spilled his milk and Emily was scolded over a dropped slice of apple, Tom watched her through the small monitor in the basement. She cleaned the floor in silence, then quietly carried a small plate back into the kitchen. No one noticed because Melinda was in the living room on a cheerful phone call, her voice light and elegant, the picture of a perfect hostess. But Tom saw it. Tracy gently placed a few neatly cut pieces of banana onto a side plate, then set it in front of Jackson. She didn't call his name, didn't meet his gaze, simply left the plate there as though it had always been part of the meal. Jackson looked up, startled but unsure whether he should smile. He turned to glance at his sister, then reached out and carefully took a piece, slipping it into his mouth like a child afraid of being caught doing something wrong. Tom felt a rush of emotion, not just because of Tracy's quiet kindness, but because of the way the children responded to it. They had grown used to not being allowed. Even when something good came their way, they feared they didn't deserve it. Tracy, the name Melinda never bothered to pronounce correctly, seemed to understand more than anyone in the house that kindness sometimes needed to be invisible. She never said it aloud, never showed whose side she was on. But it was in her silence that Tom saw she was doing more than anyone else. One afternoon, while Melinda was out at a luncheon with friends, Tracy brought lunch down to Tom. It wasn't her duty, but she did it as if it were the most natural thing. A simple plate of fried rice, a glass of water, and a few slices of fruit were arranged carefully on a tray. When she placed it on the small wooden table where Tom sat pretending to study plumbing diagrams, he looked up with tired eyes. She sat across from him, pulling a cloth from her pocket to wipe her hands. The basement was quiet except for the hum of the ventilation fan and the soft clinking of a spoon against the plate. Tom broke the silence first. "Thank you. No one in this house does that but you." Tracy smiled, a quiet, honest smile. "I know you're not like the others I've worked with." Tom tilted his head slightly. "What do you mean?" She looked at him for a few seconds before speaking, her voice low. "I worked in another home years ago. The child there was yelled at by his father every day. No real reason, just the anger of an adult that never seemed to fade. I didn't do anything. I needed that job. Later, I heard the boy was sent to live with his grandmother. I didn't sleep for nights. I made a promise to myself. If I ever saw something like that again, I wouldn't stay silent." Tom sat still for a long time. He could hear the weight in her voice like a scar that never quite healed. "At last," he said quietly, "I used to think I was doing everything right. Building a beautiful home, hiring people to help, choosing a woman I thought was kind. But maybe I was wrong." Tracy nodded. She didn't judge. Her eyes said she understood, not because she had seen everything, but because she had lived through that same helplessness before. When she stood, lifting the now empty tray, she paused. Those two children, they need someone watching over them, even if it's from a distance. Tom responded with a slow, heavy nod. He still couldn't tell her that he was their father, that he wasn't just a plumber passing through. But he knew now that down in the cold basement, he wasn't alone. Tracy was the only person in that house, besides himself, who saw the children not as the well-dressed offspring of a wealthy family, but as two young souls slowly being worn down by small daily wounds. And she didn't turn away. Tom understood that her quiet presence couldn't replace a father, but it was like a small candle burning in the night, reminding him that there was still light to believe in. And sometimes, the people who say the least are the ones doing the most to protect what matters. Since that quiet conversation in the basement, something unspoken had settled between Tom and Tracy, not a pact, not a promise, just a kind of silence deep enough to know they were standing on the same side, even if neither ever named it aloud. Tom continued in his role as the plumber, quiet, unobtrusive, at times even deliberately clumsy, like a man unfamiliar with manual work. But Tracy never questioned it. She didn't pry, didn't test the seams of his story. She simply left meals at the same hour each day, sometimes a chilled glass of lemon water in the late afternoon, sometimes a cookie wrapped neatly in a folded napkin. At first, Tom thought these were small courtesies, but soon he realized they were deliberate acts of kindness, offered carefully, as if she feared that giving too much might put someone at risk. One morning, as Tom was inspecting a steam pipe near the storage room at the far end of the first-floor hallway, Tracy passed by carrying a basket of freshly laundered clothes. She paused for a moment, then turned to him. "Do you need anything? You've been working non-stop these past few days. Must be exhausting." Tom started to shake his head but stopped. "Would you mind helping me check the hot water line connected to the washer? I think there might be a blockage." Tracy nodded. They walked together into the laundry room. As she lifted the washer lid, Tom watched her eyes, her movements. Nothing in her was flustered. She wasn't someone easily rattled, but he also saw the small habits of caution etched into her over time, the way she closed doors gently, the way she glanced behind before touching anything. These weren't quirks. They were patterns, shaped by years of watching, waiting, surviving. While Tom knelt beside the pipe, pretending to examine the valve, he spoke quietly. "You're very good at keeping your distance. No one in this house ever feels intruded upon by you. But the kids, they're different." Tracy was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I don't want them to think I'm being too kind. If Melinda thinks I'm getting too close, she'll notice me." Tom turned to face her. "Aren't you afraid? If you see something wrong, don't you want to speak up?" Tracy set the basket down and leaned against the washer. "You know, sometimes kindness has to wear silence to survive. If I get fired, There'll be no one left here to bring them fruit or cover them with a blanket when it gets cold. No one to wipe Emily's tears when she cries alone in her room. Tom felt his throat tighten. She was right. And that truth stung him more deeply than he expected, because she was doing the very things he should have done. She was protecting his children. That afternoon, Tom returned to the basement with a weight in his chest he couldn't shake. He replayed audio from the camera positioned near the living room. Melinda's voice flowed smoothly through the speaker as she chatted with a friend. Everything is under control. The kids are finally starting to listen. No more whining, no more crying. I don't show them weakness. They need to learn that emotion isn't a bargaining tool. Tom closed the notebook he had been writing in. Every word out of her mouth confirmed what had become increasingly clear. This wasn't just coldness, this was control. A deliberate system of domination, a woman who believed that affection was weakness and that children were meant to submit, not be nurtured. In the stillness of the basement, Tom thought of Tracy, a housekeeper with no authority, no title, no voice in that household, yet somehow the only person fighting to keep the last bits of humanity alive in his children's hearts. She couldn't take his place. She couldn't undo what had been done. But she had given Emily and Jackson small flickers of warmth enough that when the time came for him to step forward, they might still remember what kindness felt like. And in a world where tenderness is often mistaken for fragility, Tom realized that Tracy was the rare, steady presence keeping hope alive in that cold, echoing house. She asked for nothing. She expected nothing. But her quiet defiance, carried out through simple gestures and a fierce restraint, had become the only thing holding the cracks of this fragile world from breaking completely apart. The next day, the rain came. Spring rain in Nashville did not crash down like a storm, but fell in a steady, quiet way that seemed to seep into the walls, making the already cold house feel even darker. Tom sat in the basement with his back against the wall, listening to the soft dripping from an old pipe landing in the metal pan he had placed beneath it to mimic the sound of work. But his attention was fixed elsewhere. He was watching the camera feed from the upstairs hallway outside Emily and Jackson's rooms. It was the weekend. On any other weekend, he would have taken the children for a walk around the lake or helped them bake together in the kitchen. But today his children had been forbidden to leave their rooms for a reason too small to be called a mistake. Emily had left an old doll on the living room sofa. That was all. The doll was the last keepsake from her mother. Tom remembered giving it to her on her 6th birthday, telling her it was a gift her mother had chosen before she passed. Emily treasured it and knew something sacred. Yet that morning, Melinda stepped into the living room, saw the doll lying sideways on the sofa, and immediately called Emily downstairs in a sharp, impatient tone. "Do you not know how to clean? This house is not a place to scatter toys." When Emily whispered an apology, Melinda did not listen. She picked up the doll, walked straight to the backyard trash bin, lifted the lid, and tossed it in without hesitation. "If you leave things lying around again, everything else will disappear just like this." Emily stood frozen at the window, her small hands gripping the hem of her shirt, not crying, not shouting, only watching with a silence that felt like something precious had been severed from her. Tom saw it all through the lens and felt his throat tighten. He knew that for a child, a toy is never just a toy. It is a piece of memory, of love, a point of connection to someone they can no longer touch. Losing it was losing the last thread to her mother. Less than an hour later, it was Jackson's turn to be punished. He loved a soft blue blanket embroidered with a small whale, something he held tightly every night when he fell asleep. But that morning, Melinda walked into his room and saw the blanket had slipped to the floor. She said almost nothing. She simply picked it up, folded it neatly, and took it away. She did not return it to the bed. She walked out with it in her hands. Jackson watched her go, his eyes wide, his lips pressed tight, his fingers gripping the pillow. He did not ask for it back. He did not dare. Only after she was gone did he turn his face toward the wall and rest his head on his bare arm, breathing like someone swallowing sorrow. In the basement, Tom stopped the video. He could not watch another second. Helplessness washed over him like a rising tide. He could not understand why Melinda behaved this way. No harsh words, no slap. Yet what she did was colder than violence. She did not strike. She took away the small things that made a child feel safe. She did not shout. She used deprivation to teach them that feelings had no value. When Tracy walked past the little girl's room, she paused. Tom saw her gaze fall on the empty bed, on the small shoulders trembling beneath the thin blanket. Then she turned quickly toward the storage closet, pulled out a small cream-colored pillow, and placed it gently on Emily's bed. She said nothing. After that, she found an old wool blanket, not the same as Jackson's lost one, but soft enough, clean enough, and laid it at the foot of the boy's bed. These small acts could have been considered stepping beyond her duties, but to Tom they were the clearest acts of kindness he had witnessed in years. And in that moment, he understood that if Melinda was stripping away the emotional warmth from his children, Tracy was quietly storing it for him piece by piece. That night, Tom sat with his notebook. No toy, no warm blanket, no loving words. But there was still Tracy. And as long as she remained in that house, he believed that somewhere inside Emily and Jackson there was still a corner not yet frozen. He swore to himself that soon, very soon, he would not allow this silence to last another day. That night, Tom lay unmoving on the old folding bed in the basement, his eyes wide open in the dark. He had thought long and hard about stepping out of the shadows and ending this entire charade at once, but a quiet voice kept circling in his mind. Not yet. There is nothing that binds her to her actions. If he confronted her with nothing but emotion, she would twist it, turn herself into the wounded party, and deny everything. Tom needed proof that could not be erased, not a retelling, not an accusation. He needed voices, footsteps, the sharp edge of cruelty captured exactly as his children had been forced to feel it. The next morning he drove to a small electronics shop on the outskirts of town, a place where no one knew him under the name Tom Lancaster. He bought a recording device no larger than his finger, small enough to fit beneath a table or behind a light switch. When he returned to the house, he waited until Melinda took Emily out for a haircut, then acted quickly. Tracy didn't ask a word. She only paused, looked at him for a few seconds with an unspoken understanding, then continued wiping the staircase. Tom placed the first device at the base of the dining table, the place where Melinda often talked on the phone during breakfast. Around noon, he sat outside the kitchen pretending to repair the drain line and quietly activated the recorder. A few minutes later, Melinda entered, her voice smooth, steady, as if nothing in her world had ever gone wrong. She was on the phone, but the words made Tom clench his jaw. They behave better now. I cut down their toys, threw out the silly doll, and stopped giving them sweets. Children only need to feel fear. They don't need affection. Affection ruins them. On the other end, someone laughed softly. Melinda joined in, her laugh sharp enough to slice the air. Her tone shifted instantly when Emily and Jackson stepped in from the yard. "Who gave you permission to come in when adults are talking? Go outside. No playing in the house." Tom held his breath as he heard the small footsteps retreat, followed by a faint door closing. The recording ended in silence, but within that silence was a certainty. This was no longer suspicion. This was confession. That afternoon he planted 2 more devices, one behind the bookshelf near the living room, one inside the cupboard where voices echoed clearly. This time he waited. And when night arrived, the recording that followed tightened his chest. Melinda sat alone with a glass of wine, speaking to someone again. They know who has the power in this house. Emily is starting to ask permission before she breathes. I want them to understand that love is not free. Children need to know the price of peace. Tom replayed the sentence again and again. Each word struck him like a blow to the ribs. The price of peace. To Melinda, obedience was proof of success, not the result of love. She didn't see the tears. She didn't hear the fear. She counted behaviors. She measured silence. When Tom saw Tracy the next morning in the kitchen, she said nothing. She simply pushed a cup of hot tea toward him. They didn't need to speak. Both knew the ending was drawing near. But Tom also understood that if he alone spoke up, people might not believe him. He needed the truth to come from Melinda's own voice, plain and cold, impossible to deny. So he kept recording. He kept listening. Every icy word became evidence. and when the moment finally arrived, he would no longer stand as the quiet plumber living beneath the floorboards. He would rise as a father, a husband, and a man ready to speak the truth that everyone else had chosen not to see. That afternoon, the sun broke gently through the clouds, casting a warm golden light through the trees in the backyard, laying soft honey-colored streaks across the brick path. Tom sat beneath the old maple tree, his back resting against a moss-covered stone wall, his weathered hands holding a sandwich that Tracy had just brought out. She placed the tray down without a word, but her eyes softened briefly when she saw him lift his tired gaze. Lunch today was a simple egg sandwich, a crisp red apple, and a glass of chilled homemade tea, nothing fancy, but enough to bring a small moment of calm to a morning that had been thick with tension. Tom offered a quiet thank you. Tracy nodded, then instead of turning back inside as she usually did, she sat down across from him, hands folded neatly in her lap. They sat in silence for a while, only the sounds of birdsong and the breeze rustling through the garden filling the space between them. Then Tracy spoke, her voice soft but steady. When I was little, we had a garden like this, but my mother never let me play in it. She was afraid I'd ruin the grass. Tom looked at her for a moment, chewing more slowly. Tracy let out a small laugh. I didn't set foot on that lawn until after she died, and it turns out it was soft, cool, and not scary at all. Tom asked gently, "Where was your father in those memories?" Tracy answered without hesitation. "Gone. He left when I was 3. I don't remember his face, just that my mother used to call him selfish." Tom looked into her eyes, eyes that held the stillness of deep water. "I imagine she had to be strong," he said. Tracy nodded. "But sometimes being too strong turns you to stone. I think she forgot I was still just a child." Her voice carried no bitterness, only the weightless sadness of a falling leaf. Tom didn't know what to say. He saw a piece of himself in her story, a father who had let grief isolate him from his children until silence became a warning sign he almost missed too late. Tracy handed him a paper napkin. "You seem like someone who's lost a lot," she said softly. Tom smiled, but it was the kind that folded sadness into it, enough to know what's worth holding on to, and foolish enough to nearly lose it again. They sat a while longer beneath the tree. From inside the house, Melinda's voice floated out through the open window, laughter too polished, too rehearsed, echoing into the garden. Tom knew he had gathered enough recordings to piece together the truth, to build a case, but he also knew for that truth to carry weight, he would need voices like Tracy's. So he asked, hesitantly, "If one day you found out I wasn't who you thought I was, what would you do?" Tracy tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "I mean, if I wasn't just a plumber, if this was all a part I've been playing." She looked at him for a long moment. "I've known." Tom froze. She smiled gently, not mocking, not angry. "Your hands don't have the calluses of someone who's worked years in labor. You walk carefully. You speak like someone who's been educated, and no one cleans a faucet from the outside in unless they have been trained to." For the first time in days, Tom laughed. "I thought I'd hidden it well." "Not bad," she said, "but I've been here long enough to know the difference between people who pretend and people who care." Her words settled over him like a quiet balm. "I don't know who you are," she added, "but I know you care about those kids more than anyone who's ever walked into that house, and that's enough for me." That afternoon, the sandwich no longer felt cold and tasteless, and the words between them no longer felt cautious. It wasn't a conversation between a maid and a stranger with secrets, but between two people who had known pain, who were quietly gathering the broken pieces of love and trying to patch something that once had cracked too deep. When Tracy stood and walked back toward the house, Tom watched her disappear through the door, and for the first time in many days he didn't feel alone in this fight. That evening, Tom sat alone beneath the dim light in the basement, the small recorder resting on the worn wooden table beside a tattered leather notebook. Each voice clip of Melinda played like the stroke of a blade against his chest. Every insult, every cold command drove another nail into his quiet resolve. But beneath the anger, something deeper had begun to take shape within him, a kind of harsh stillness he had never known before. The days spent living under the guise of a plumber had taught him to see the world from below, from the shadows of power he once stood confidently above. And perhaps because of that, his eyes had grown calloused. These were the same eyes that had once wept when his wife died, that had once lit up watching Emily take her first wobbly run across the grass, or when Jackson looked up at him and murmured those first shy words, "Daddy." Now they held only endurance and patience, worn down like a blade honed on stone. What Melinda did no longer shocked him. It chilled him not with surprise, but with a kind of knowing cold that settled deep in the marrow. He remembered that morning, just the day before, when he had walked into the living room and seen Emily standing still, hands clenched tight, all because she had dropped a book. Melinda hadn't laid a finger on her. She didn't need to. Her voice alone had made the 6-year-old shrink back into herself like a frightened snail. Tom had not stepped in. He had stood at the threshold, hidden behind his workman's clothes, swallowing down 100 protests that had risen in his throat like fire. That was the moment Tom understood what he had become: a man with calloused eyes, a man who watched cruelty unfold and could not immediately stop it. Not because he didn't want to, but because he had to wait. Tracy had once asked him, quietly but piercingly, "Why don't you stop her when you see what she does?" Tom hadn't answered. But now, in the quiet ache of his own heart, he knew the answer. Because justice doesn't come from one loud shout. It comes from silent preparation, steady and sure. That day, as he passed the playroom now stripped bare, no toys left, no colors, no laughter, he saw Jackson curled up, clutching a pillow, staring up at the ceiling as if searching for another world. Tom sat beside him, wordless. After a long pause, Jackson whispered, barely audible, "I miss Mommy." Tom turned his face away. He couldn't lie. He couldn't tell the boy it would all be okay, not yet, because the truth was, it wasn't okay, not now. But he also knew that his silence, his steady, unmoving presence was perhaps the most honest comfort he could offer. A man who once lit up with joy, now simply watched, quiet, weathered, holding the weight of 2 small lives that he hadn't been able to protect at the beginning. And yet, still there. Still watching. Still waiting for the moment he would no longer need to stay silent. That evening, when Tracy quietly placed dinner on the kitchen counter and turned to leave, Tom called to her softly, "Thank you." She paused, glanced back at him, didn't smile, but nodded. A silent acknowledgement exchanged between 2 people who could both see what others refused to see. When she was gone, Tom remained there, staring at the chair where Emily used to sit, barely daring to chew loud enough to be heard. He looked at the high chair, still pushed against the wall, where his late wife had once spoon-fed Jackson his first bites of warm porridge. This house had once been full of laughter. Now it was filled only with cautious footsteps and whispered apologies for crimes too small to name, and Tom knew he was nearing the edge of what he could endure. But if he stepped back now, everything would reset. Melinda would erase it all: the evidence, the tension, the quiet bruises of spirit, and no one would believe what he had seen. The calluses in his eyes, the ones that had formed through weeks of silence, would mean nothing if he did not act. So he opened the notebook again, and with a steady hand, wrote one more line. Tomorrow, place another recorder near the staircase. She scolds Jackson there when he walks too slowly. Record everything. Then he turned off the lamp. But even in the dark, his eyes remained open wide, watchful as if refusing to rest until the full truth was finally exposed. They were no longer the eyes of a billionaire who once commanded boardrooms and clean energy empires. They were the eyes of a father, a witness, a man slowly becoming unyielding, because 2 children needed to live a life where childhood was not a thing they had to survive. The next morning, the sky over Nashville hung low and gray, clouds like lead pressing down above the quiet suburbs. A cold wind slipped through the windows of the lakeside house, brushing against the walls like breath held too long. Tom walked slowly down the hallway toward the garden, pushing an old lawnmower that he had deliberately sabotaged to rattle and grind, giving him an excuse to linger near the dining room window. Inside, Melinda moved around the kitchen, her voice sharp even when she spoke quietly. Emily had spilled a little milk on the floor, and Melinda, without raising her volume, managed to stab each word into the air like a needle. How many times have I told you to be careful? You can't even pour milk without making a mess. Do you think you're a princess or something?" Emily said nothing. She lowered her head and took a paper towel, wiping each drop with trembling hands. Tom took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on the reflection in the window, not at Melinda, but at his daughter's small figure, shrinking with every word. His chest tightened, not from surprise, but from the deep, aching familiarity of it. More than 30 years ago, he had been that child. His stepfather had once made him wipe the floor after spilling orange juice, and when young Tom apologized, the man had answered by kicking the dog's food bowl across the room, then forcing him to pick up each scattered pellet by hand. "You better learn how to be tidy unless you want people to treat you like your mother." That was the first time Tom understood that some adults don't love children, they rule them. And now, Melinda polished, educated, elegant Melinda was repeating the same cruelty within the very walls Tom had built to keep his children safe. History was repeating itself, but this time, Tom was not the boy who bent his head and swallowed shame. He was the father who remembered the taste of that pain, and he would not let his children walk that road alone. Not again. Not ever. That afternoon, Melinda hosted a light lunch for two old friends visiting from Denver. They were women dressed with polished elegance, wearing sunglasses even indoors, and laughing in high metallic tones like wind chimes made of steel. When Emily and Jackson appeared, dressed in outfits pressed so crisply their seams looked carved, one of the women let out a coo. "Oh my goodness, Melinda, look at them. These children are just exactly what you'd call well-behaved." Melinda smiled, her voice smooth as silk, but cold as marble. "They know how to behave when it matters. They understand I don't tolerate clutter or noise." Tom stood at the edge of the garden, pruning a lavender bush with slow, measured hands, his eyes locked on every gesture Melinda made. Her words were nearly identical to what his stepfather once boasted to neighbors, while forcing a young Tom to stand motionless in the yard all afternoon, a show of strict upbringing. Children must fear you to become decent people. Fear, not understanding. Melinda was now repeating that same twisted creed, unaware that the man standing quietly behind the hedge knew it better than anyone. After lunch, when the guests had gone and the polished charm melted from Melinda's face, she returned to her usual icy expression. She stepped into the playroom, where Emily was gently folding tiny doll clothes, placing each item neatly into a small box. Melinda picked up a velvet doll hat, holding it between her fingers like something distasteful, then spoke in a hiss. "You think good girls play with things like this? This is for silly children with no ambition." She tossed the hat into the trash and motioned for Emily to stand. "No more toys in this house. From now on, every spare minute will be used for studying or cleaning." Emily opened her mouth, as if to speak, then closed it again. Jackson stood in the doorway, lips pressed tight, eyes wide as he watched his sister. The sight struck Tom like a lightning bolt from the past. It was an exact replica of a memory he had spent a lifetime trying to bury, standing helpless as his mother was humiliated, unable to do anything but burn every word into his memory like ink, on skin. Across the hallway, Tracy stood still. She had witnessed the whole exchange. Her eyes met Tom's through the pane of glass. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be. The silence between them was full, heavy with understanding. That night, back in the basement, Tom opened the notebook whose pages were already thick with words. He wrote a single line more. "History is repeating itself, but this time it will not end the same way. I stayed silent once and lived with that weight my whole life. But Emily and Jackson will not carry that burden. This time, the truth will be spoken. And no one, not Melinda, not anyone, will silence it." That afternoon, the air inside the stone house seemed to thicken, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. After sending her two friends off with practiced hugs and those polished smiles she wore like jewelry, Melinda shut the front door with a force she rarely used. The echo rolled through the hallway and reached all the way down into the basement, where Tom sat listening to the last recording from her luncheon. He had captured her bragging about discipline built on fear, about molding children through rules and cold obedience. He needed no more explanations. Those words alone stripped away every polished layer she had crafted. but what happened next pushed everything past a point he could no longer tolerate. Emily had just finished rinsing a glass of orange juice for her stepmother, her small hands wet and shaking from the cold water. She placed the glass carefully on the tray, yet her fingers slipped just slightly. The glass rolled, tipped, and fell. The sound of shattering glass cracked through the kitchen like a scream. Shards scattered across the tile, and a few pieces cut into the soft skin of her bare feet. The little girl panicked, dropping to her knees, trying to gather the pieces, her voice thin with fear. "I'm sorry, Mother Melinda. I'll clean it. I'm sorry." Melinda turned, and anger warped her face into something harsh and sharp. "Your apology doesn't fix the glass. Why are you always like this? Why can you never do anything right? You embarrass me. You make me look like a fool in front of my friends." Then, almost without thought, she raised her hand, but it never reached Emily. Tracy stepped between them in a single swift motion. Melinda's hand hit her shoulder instead, not hard, but hard enough to freeze the entire room. For a moment, no one said a word. Then Tracy knelt beside Emily, her voice trembling yet firm. "She's hurt." "Let me bandage her feet first." Melinda drew back, her face flushing with shock and embarrassment. "What are you doing, Tracy? This is my house. Do not interfere." But Tracy didn't look at her. She held Emily close and whispered, "You're all right. I've got you." Melinda drew in a breath to yell again, but a voice from the doorway cut through the room like a blade. "Enough." She spun around. There, standing in the kitchen doorway, was the man she believed to be the quiet plumber. But his eyes no longer held the bowed patience of a hired worker. It was the gaze of a father who had just watched his daughter bear one cruelty too many. Tom stepped forward, slow and steady, his eyes locked on Melinda. She stepped back a half pace before forcing a brittle smile. "What do you think you're doing? This is a family matter. Stay out of it if you want to keep your job." Tom said nothing at first. He simply stood between her and the child now trembling in Tracy's arms. He looked down at Emily, saw the tear-streaked face pressed against Tracy's shoulder, saw the small cuts across her feet. His voice, when it came, was low and even. "She is 6 years old. She deserves to play, to make mistakes, to be loved, not to live in fear in her own home." Tracy carried Emily out of the kitchen without looking back. When the door closed behind them, Tom and Melinda stood alone in the stillness, her voice lowered, laced with anger. "Who do you think you are to speak to me like that? I am the woman of this house. I'm raising these children the right way." Tom nodded once, slowly. "Yes, you were the woman I believed could stand where their mother once stood. I trusted you. I put my faith in you. But today, I've seen enough. The cuts on my daughter's feet, the tears you have never wiped, the blows you've nearly delivered but held just out of reach like a shadow over their heads. All of that is evidence." He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the small recorder. "And there's more. Your voice. Every cruel word, every order, every insult. I have all of it." Melinda's face drained of color. The practiced composure cracked. No smile, no control, only fear. She understood. The line had been crossed. The man standing before her was no longer a worker disguised in worn denim. He was a father drawing a hard boundary that she would never step past again. In that moment, the sound of the shattered glass still lingered in the kitchen like a final warning. Some limits, once reached, cannot be undone. And for Tom, that limit was the sound of his daughter's cry and the sight of blood on her small, frightened feet. That night, Tom sat alone in the basement, beside him a small wooden box holding every recording device, every tape, memory card, and a notebook so densely filled with notes it seemed ready to burst. Each line of writing felt like a blade slicing through a father's heart. He turned the pages slowly, reliving every moment Melinda had let her fury loose on his children, each cold remark, each sharp glance that made Emily shrink back as if she might fall, each time Jackson held his breath after dropping a spoon on the floor. Every recorded sound, no matter how faint, echoed like a warning bell in his ears. He listened again to the recording from the day the glass broke, Melinda's voice cutting through the silence, cold as stone. "You're an embarrassment. You make me look bad in front of my friends." Then came the crash. Emily's footsteps fleeing down the hall, Tracy's startled gasp in his own voice, rough and straining to hold in his anger. That's enough. Tom closed his eyes and let the sounds play again. Not because he wanted to wallow in the pain, but because he needed certainty. He needed to know the exact moment. He understood that truth was not only something to be seen, it had to be proven. He couldn't banish Melinda from his children's lives on a surge of emotion. It had to be undeniable, irrefutable. He picked up his phone and called the one lawyer he trusted most, an old man named Vincent. "I need a private meeting tomorrow. It's a family matter." His voice was steady but cold. Vincent agreed at once. He didn't ask for details, just said, "If you're calling at this hour, I assume it's not something small." The next morning, Tom arrived at the law office carrying a box. No one recognized the man in coveralls, his hands still streaked with old paint, as the billionaire who once graced magazine covers. Vincent saw him only once and knew. He looked older than he had at their last meeting, but his eyes were different now. They held the look of someone who had just walked out of a war. Tom set the box on the table, opened it, and began to speak. He started from the first day he noticed something wrong in his daughter's eyes. When Emily began avoiding him, when Jackson would fall silent the moment Melinda entered the room. He spoke of those early days spent living in his own basement, disguised as a plumber, scrubbing toilets and polishing copper pipes just to be close without drawing suspicion. He spoke of Tracy, the only one in that cold house who still looked at him with any warmth, a house that now felt more like an abandoned nursing home than a home for children. Vincent didn't interrupt. He sat still, hands clasped before him, nodding gently from time to time. When Tom played a clip from one of the recordings, Vincent looked straight at him. "You know this will change everything, don't you?" Tom nodded. "I don't care what the public thinks. I just want my children to never again feel a chill of fear when they hear footsteps in their own home." Vincent was silent for a while, then said, "There are 3 things we must do. First, we make sure the children are safe. Second, we ensure every piece of evidence is legally admissible. Third, when you unmask her, there must be witnesses, people who will never forget what they see." Tom nodded. "I've already planned the weekend gathering. Melinda is inviting her friends over to show off how angelic the kids have become." Vincent smiled, a slow, cold smile. "Then we'll let them see just what kind of wings her angel truly has." That afternoon, Tom returned to the mansion as he did every day. Melinda said nothing about the night before. Her silence was not forgiveness. It was rage wrapped in sweetness, anger pressed into forced smiles and unusually gentle words. She gave Jackson an extra spoonful of yogurt and told Emily she could watch cartoons for 10 minutes after dinner. But Tom knew this was the stillness before a storm. Melinda was performing, rearranging the pieces in her mind, plotting to regain control. What she didn't know was that this performance was nearing its final act, and this time the audience would not remain passive. Tom bent down and wiped the puddle near the dishwasher, just beside where he had placed a new recorder. The voice inside him spoke clearly. "It is not because I am wealthy that I have this right. It is because I am a father, and a father must rise when his child no longer can." The next morning, Tom's mansion no longer carried its usual illusion of peace. The air felt heavier than usual, thick with silence so dense one could hear the fall of a single pin. Melinda entered the kitchen in a wine-colored silk dress, her hair curled to precision, her lips painted a striking red that only sharpened the chill in her expression. Today was her brunch, the day she would welcome her wealthy friends, the women she had long sought to impress, to prove to them she was the perfect hostess with a flawless family, obedient children, and a life beyond reproach. Tom had been in the backyard since early morning, pretending to fix a sprinkler and spray the lawn. But in truth, he was watching. Every movement, every word. He knew today had to reach its peak. It was also the last day he would wear the mask. Emily wore a cream-colored dress, its stiff sleeves so tight she dared not raise her arms too high. Jackson had been dressed in a small suit, his tie crooked, his hair gelled into place. Neither child spoke. They didn't smile. They followed every instruction with the lifeless precision of trained puppets. Tracy stood quietly in the corner of the kitchen, her eyes filled with worry as she watched Melinda issue orders in a tone that sounded soft but held no warmth. Tracy tried to smile at Emily while adjusting the ribbon at the girl's back, but the child only bowed her head, too afraid to smile in return. Tom saw it all from the dining room window. That tightening sensation of helplessness had been choking him for days, but today he would sever the rope. At exactly 10 o'clock, 3 women stepped into the house in high heels, drenched in perfume and rehearsed compliments. They embraced Melinda, glanced around the home, and offered delicate laughs. The house looked immaculate. White walls, polished wooden floors, family portraits hanging in perfect alignment. No one could see the suffocating tension behind each carefully curated detail. Melinda signaled the children to come into the living room. "Smile, darling." Emily gave a weak lift of her lips, and Jackson only nodded, eyes downcast. One of the women remarked, "Such well-behaved children." Melinda smiled with pride as she poured wine into their glasses. "I'm not one to boast, but sometimes children need a little discipline. They must understand who holds authority in the home." That sentence made Tom, standing just beyond the hallway, clench his fists. He looked at Tracy, who had just placed another tray of pastries on the table, and gave a subtle nod. She understood. By midday, when everyone had taken their seats at the table, Melinda asked Emily to bring more napkins. The little girl, her hands trembling, dropped a fork onto the floor. The sharp clang of metal rang out, jarring against the thick silence that had settled over the room. Melinda stood up abruptly. She didn't shout, but her eyes were blades. "How many times do I have to say it, Emily? Being polite is not about stiffness, it's about being careful." The child lowered her head. "I'm sorry." Melinda stepped forward, hand raised, but this time Tracy moved in front of the girl, shielding her with her body. "That's enough." Her voice shook but held firm. Melinda froze, her expression twisting. "What are you doing?" Tracy didn't step back. "I won't let you hit her." The room turned to stone. The 3 guests sat frozen in place. One of them set her wineglass down on the table. "I think we should probably—" But before she could rise, a man's voice rang out from behind. "No. Please stay seated. I think this is exactly the time to witness something." All heads turned. Tom entered, no longer the handyman with paint-stained hands. He stood tall, his eyes unhidden, his presence unmasked. Melinda went pale. "Thomas, what are you doing?" Tom didn't answer right away. He slowly removed his cap, unhooked the protective glasses from his face. His voice was low, steady, and unmistakably clear. "I've been here from the beginning. I've seen everything. I've recorded everything. And I know enough now to say this cannot go on." Melinda's face drained of color, her eyes wild. "You spied on me. You disguised yourself. You've lost your mind." Tom turned to the 3 women. "You came here today to see a perfect family. I hope you don't feel your time was wasted." One of the women, her voice trembling, said, We didn't know." Tom reached into his pocket and placed a small recorder in the center of the table. "This is Melinda, the woman I once believed would bring happiness to my children. And this is her true voice." He pressed play. The sound emerged, crisp and piercing. "I don't need you to love me. I just need you to obey. Children don't need love. They need fear." One guest burst into tears. Another stood up and pulled out her phone. Tom turned back to Melinda. "Today, you have a choice. You can walk out on your own, or you can deal with my lawyer. Either way, you will never step foot in this house again." Melinda didn't answer. She stood there, still as a statue. No one breathed. Then she screamed, "Traitor!" She snatched a wineglass, ready to throw it, but Tom didn't flinch. He simply said, his voice quiet but resolute, "I haven't betrayed anyone. I'm doing what a father is meant to do, protect his children from the poison he once blindly welcomed." She let the glass fall. It shattered into pieces, just like the control she had once held so tightly. And from that moment forward, no one in that house would ever fear footsteps again. Melinda fled the living room as if the walls of the mansion were aflame behind her. The sound of her heels struck the floor in cold, sharp beats, echoing through every hallway, bouncing off every wall. All eyes turned to Tom, no longer the quiet man in the background, but a father who had stepped into the light, who had stripped away illusion with nothing but resolve and love. Emily still trembled in Tracy's arms, her eyes red from fear, yet widened with wonder. Jackson stood behind his sister, his small fingers clutching the hem of her dress. Tom walked slowly toward his children. He knelt before them, arms open, voice caught in his throat. "It's me," he said. "You don't have to be afraid anymore. No one will ever hurt you again." Emily began to cry, but it was no longer a cry of fear. It was relief. It was the sound of finally being seen, finally being safe. She threw herself into his arms, clinging to him as if letting go might wake her from a dream. Jackson came too, pressing his face into his father's shoulder, saying nothing, but letting his tiny hand speak what words could not. The three women still stood there. One had already pulled out her phone and was speaking in a low, urgent tone to her husband. Another, flustered, edged slowly toward the door, glancing around as if hoping to dissolve into the wallpaper. The last woman simply looked at Tom and gave a quiet nod. She said nothing, but in her eyes there was understanding. She had seen enough, and she was ready to stand as a witness. Tracy had not moved from Emily's side, her hand gently stroking the little girl's back in steady, soothing circles. She looked at Tom, and in her eyes was a deep compassion, but also a quiet uncertainty. She had been the one holding the line for so long, protecting the children, believing she was fighting alone in the dark. And now, the man standing before her, the man she had known only as George, was in truth their father. Tom looked at her. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I shouldn't have kept this from you. I shouldn't have left you to carry this burden alone." Tracy didn't respond immediately. Her eyes dropped to the two children still huddled against her, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, even. "I don't need an apology. I need to know that things are actually going to change." Tom nodded, slowly, firmly. "From this moment on, everything changes. Melinda is gone. And if you're willing, I'd like you to stay. Not as a housekeeper, but as the person I trust most to help care for my children as I put everything back together." Tracy was silent. She knew nothing about this would be simple. Trust is not something you reclaim just because truth has finally shown its face. But in Tom's eyes, she saw no deception. She saw only a father who had fallen, who had faltered, but who was now standing again, doing what he should have done long ago, willing to make things right, no matter the cost. From the top of the stairs came the sound of wheels dragging across hardwood. Melinda returned, a suitcase rolling behind her. Her makeup was gone, her face bare and blotched, her eyes red, her hair tangled. She glared at Tom, then turned her gaze on Tracy. Her laugh came out hoarse, bitter. "You win," she said. "But you think he won't leave you the way he left me? Let me tell you something. Men like him, they're only loyal to what makes them feel good about themselves. And the moment you stop making him feel like a good man, he'll leave you behind too." Tracy didn't answer. Tom stepped forward, placing himself between them. "Melinda," he said, "this is the last thing I'll say to you. You were not left. You were removed. And not because I stopped loving you, but because you never had a heart capable of love to begin with." She scoffed, walked past them like a bitter wind, and vanished through the front door. When the sound of her car echoed through the driveway, Tom closed his eyes for a long moment. Silence returned to the house, but this time it was not heavy. It was a pause, a quiet space where something new could begin. Tracy turned toward the stairs. "I'll take the kids up and get them changed," she said. "This party's over." Tom nodded. He watched the three of them ascend, his hand still curled tightly around the recorder in his pocket, holding it not as a weapon now, but as a reminder of everything they had survived. The mask had fallen. And now, at last, the truth had found its voice. The moment the heavy front door closed behind Melinda, Tom stood motionless in the vast foyer, as though the silence itself was anchoring him to the polished floor. The mansion he had once called home now echoed only with traces of tears, fear, and the reverberations of lies too long ignored. Images of the early days with Melinda flickered through his mind like a broken reel of film. Her sweet smile, the confident glint in her eye, the graceful charm of a woman who knew how to become the perfect figure in the eyes of a widower. Tom had believed, or more truthfully, he had wanted to believe that he could find happiness again, not just for himself, but for his children, after the long and hollow years of loss. But now he understood. What he had offered was not healing, not renewal. It had been an open door for someone cold and calculating to step in and seize control of lives too young to defend themselves. The dream of a complete family, of a loving stepmother, of a beautiful second chance, it had all collapsed. Tom walked slowly toward the staircase, his steps heavy as stone. From upstairs, he could hear Tracy's quiet voice as she soothed Emily and Jackson in their room. A faint scent of baby powder and lavender drifted through the hallway, softening something sharp in his chest. He paused at the doorway, not yet ready to step inside. From within, Emily's voice, barely above a whisper, reached him, still quivering. "Miss Tracy, is he really here? You're not tricking me, are you?" Tracy's voice came gently, like a lullaby passed from mother to child. "He's here, sweetheart. He's the one who's been with you these past days. You just didn't know it. He saw everything. And he won't let anyone hurt you again. He's going to protect you." Tom leaned his head against the doorframe, his eyes stinging. Those were the words he had longed to hear from the woman he once married, words that had never come. He knew he had been silent for too long. He had let his children live in the shadows of something he should have stopped. Now it was time to begin again, from the smallest place, to listen, to be present, to step in. He gently pushed the door open. 3 pairs of eyes lifted toward him. Tracy sat at the edge of the bed with Emily in her lap, while Jackson clutched a small stuffed animal, his little fingers wrapped tightly around its paw. The room looked the same, but something essential had shifted. Tom sat down beside them, his hands trembling slightly. "Kids, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner. I made a mistake trusting someone I should never have trusted." Emily looked at him, her eyes wet and shining. So you know everything now, Dad?" Tom nodded and pulled both children close. "I know. I saw every time she yelled at you, every time you cried and no one came. I saw it all, and I'm here now to make it right." Jackson rubbed his eyes, his voice soft as wind through a cracked window. "You're not leaving again, right? You're staying home?" Tom wrapped his arms around them both. "I'm not going anywhere. From now on, I'm always going to be here." Tracy rose quietly, meaning to step out and give them space, but Tom looked up, meeting her gaze. "Tracy, I need to thank you. Without you, I don't know how long it would have taken me to see what was happening under my own roof." She shook her head. "I just did what any decent adult would do." But Tom didn't look away. "It was more than that. You were the only safe place these children had when they had no one else." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a copy of the recording and a folder of documents. "I'm taking this to the lawyer. Melinda will never have another chance to get close to my kids again." Tracy nodded. It was over. But there was still something in her eyes, something unspoken. Tom sensed it. He stood and followed her into the hallway. "Is there something you want to say to me?" Tracy paused, then answered gently. "You lied to me, not to hurt me, I know that. But you didn't trust me enough to tell the truth. You let me carry the weight. You let me be afraid. You left me alone." Tom exhaled slowly. "I know, and I don't expect forgiveness, not right away. I'm just asking for a chance to make it right. Not just for my children, but for you too." Tracy met his eyes, saw the exhaustion there, but also something unwavering. "I'm not making any promises, but I'll stay. Not for you, for the kids. They need something steady before I can decide anything more." Tom nodded, his heart full of quiet gratitude. "Thank you." As Tracy returned to the children's room, Tom remained in the hallway, standing alone but no longer lost. It felt as though he had just stepped out of a long, dark dream. The illusions had shattered, but from those broken pieces, something more real was beginning to take shape. A chance. A beginning. And this time, he would not let himself close his eyes to the truth again. After Melinda left the mansion, the house that had once been stifled by harsh voices and the quiet sobs of children slowly returned to stillness. But it was no longer the cold, suffocating kind of silence. It was a peace that settled gradually, like the surface of a lake after a long storm. Tom knew well that what had just unfolded was not an end, but a beginning. The confrontation had passed, but what lay ahead was the long, uneven path of healing. That morning, he woke early. There were no echoing heels against the hardwood, no sharp commands barked across the rooms, just sunlight spilling gently through the windows and the soft sound of laughter from the children's room. Tom brewed coffee, his hands still trembling slightly as the memory crept back those days. He walked these halls, unaware that his own children were living in fear beneath his roof. Now, he wanted every act, every word, to become a warm blanket laid gently across the unseen cracks Melinda had left behind. He prepared breakfast, not something reheated by a housekeeper, but made by his own hands. For the first time in years, he boiled eggs, toasted bread, poured milk into the ceramic cup with a superhero decal that Jackson loved. When he carried the tray upstairs, he found the children already awake, their hair tousled, eyes still heavy with sleep. He set the tray down softly. "Breakfast is here, my loves." Emily looked up, her eyes still cautious. "Dad, you really made this?" Tom nodded and smiled. "I wanted to cook for you myself. From now on, no one will scold you for eating slowly or spilling your milk." Jackson carefully picked up a piece of egg and glanced at his sister. Emily took a bite of toast, then whispered, "It's really good, Dad." Tom sat beside them on the bed, and he could feel it, the thin sheet of ice around their hearts beginning to melt. Tracy had stayed, though the distance between them was clear. She still cared for the children, still kept the house running with quiet grace, but the gentle conversations beneath the old oak tree were gone now, replaced with silence during midday meals and simple nods in passing. Tom didn't blame her. He understood. The truth he had kept hidden had left a scar, one that wouldn't be soothed with words alone. So he didn't push. Instead, he showed gratitude through small gestures. A fresh lavender plant placed outside her door. A handwritten card, simple but honest, thanking her for her courage. And above all, the freedom to choose to stay, to walk away, to forgive or not without pressure, without expectations, without being controlled. One quiet weekend afternoon, Tom invited a child therapist to visit. Not to force his children into therapy, but simply as a guest, someone to sit with them, talk softly, and play. Emily withdrew at first, pulling her knees to her chest, wary of another stranger. But when the woman began telling stories of talking teddy bears and monsters under the bed that could only be banished with a magic chant, Emily let out the tiniest laugh. Jackson, quicker to trust, climbed right into her lap, proudly holding up his plastic robot as if to introduce her to his own little protector. Tom watched from the hallway, his heart easing. Each passing day felt like another small brick laid in the rebuilding of a home, one not made of walls and ceilings, but of safety and trust. Before long, he repainted their rooms. The once cold white walls gave way to vibrant murals of rainbows and forests, the windows dressed in soft sea-blue curtains that let the light in gently. When the children stepped in, their eyes went wide with wonder. "Is this really our room?" Emily asked. Tom nodded. "You can pick anything to draw on the walls, and if you want, I'll draw with you." Jackson leapt onto the bed, bouncing with joy. "I want to draw a dinosaur driving a truck." All three of them burst into laughter. It was a sound Tom hadn't realized he had missed so deeply. But hearing it now, it felt like something precious had come home. In the days that followed, Tom began quietly restoring the house, shelf by shelf, frame by frame. He took down the portraits Melinda had hung in every room and replaced them with older photographs, images of the woman who had once shared his life, the mother of Emily and Jackson. He wanted his children to know that their mother had never left this house in spirit, that her memory wasn't something to be erased just because someone new had entered. One afternoon, Tracy stood before one of those photos for a long time. At last, she turned to Tom. "That day, you told me I was the only light in this house, but I think the real light came when you finally chose to see the truth." Tom nodded gently. "Then from now on, let's keep that light alive together." Tracy didn't reply, but the faint smile at the corner of her lips tightened something in his chest, a quiet warmth, a flicker of hope. The house had been broken, but now, piece by piece, it was being stitched back together with honesty, with love, and with quiet acts of atonement. Tom knew the road ahead would be long, but at least he had begun walking it, and this time, he wouldn't turn away. As time moved forward, sunlight filtered through the oak trees. In the backyard, casting soft shadows across the porch where Emily and Jackson sat coloring while Tom trimmed the newly blooming hydrangeas. There was no fear in their eyes now, no shadow in their laughter, no sense of footsteps needing to be dodged. Their giggles rang out whenever colors spilled across the page, or when Jackson accidentally painted his hand into a red dinosaur, while Emily carefully drew a rainbow with their mother's name at its center. Tracy stepped outside with 2 glasses of chilled orange juice, set them on the table, then took a seat beside the children, her smile calm and kind. Tom paused in his work to take it all in. For so long, he had believed that a family could be built with wealth, with logical choices, with clean lines and good intentions on paper. But only when everything fell apart did he begin to understand. A home isn't made of walls and structure. It's made of presence, of listening, of timely embraces, of someone choosing to stay when everything feels broken. Life often teaches us through its most brutal lessons, and in that pain, we finally learn what is truly worth protecting. For Tom, it was the peace he had once lost. It was 2 children who were still innocent enough to forgive. It was a woman named Tracy who had quietly shielded his children when he hadn't been brave enough to face the truth. And perhaps most of all, it was himself, the man who had once shut down his feelings, now learning to move forward by listening to the voice of his own heart and walking again, not by habit, but by choice. Dear friend, if you've stayed with us through this journey, then I believe you've felt the weight and the quiet power of this story. A story not only of harm and betrayal, but of the fragile, beautiful return to light inside one's own home. Have you ever suspected something but lacked the courage to face it? Have you ever thought your silence was protection, only to learn that what someone needed most was your voice? The story of Tom, Emily, Jackson, and Tracy reminds us that love isn't found in perfect conditions, but in how we respond when everything becomes imperfect. That sometimes the bravest act is not defeating someone else, but facing the indifference within ourselves. If this story touched something in your heart, we'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Share your thoughts, memories, or personal lessons. Your voice might be the light someone else needs. And if you find comfort in stories that reflect on life, healing, and hope, consider subscribing to Emotional Echoes. Give this story a like and share it with others. Every follow is a quiet hand on our shoulder, reminding us why we do what we do to bring stories that help you hear your own heart through the noise of life. Thank you for spending your precious time with us on this journey. May you and your loved ones be blessed with strength, peace of mind, and a life full of quiet, honest joys. Until next time, from all of us at Emotional Echoes, be well.